The dysfunctional family actually has become a mainstay in our culture. Maybe it always was. But more and more in recent years, there have been a lot of things been written about how do you deal with things in that dysfunctional family setting. I want to talk about a dysfunctional family of the Old Testament. And if you have heard these details before, that's just a review. But if you haven't heard all these details, it may be an eye-opener. Often when you hear some people talk about the revolt of Absalom, Prince Absalom, against King David, his father, sometimes it's actually spoken of in terms of here is a son that is just kind of bad and evil. He's very selfish and greedy, and it's his problem, and he's trying to drive his father out and take over the kingdom. That is really a conclusion that does not really square with the facts, and the details have been there all along. The story actually begins back in chapter 3 of 2 Samuel, and it starts listing the sons, the children, especially the sons that have been born to King David. It's a dysfunctional family from the very beginning. David, in chapters 3 through 10, has been trying to continue to build up and strengthen his kingdom, enlarge the borders of that kingdom. He's actually married a large number of women. And among those many women he has married, there's some diplomatic marriages, but you have all of these children that are born in those settings. The oldest one is named Amnon. He has a half-brother that's not too far behind him in age named Absalom. And as we get further into 2 Samuel, the story of Amnon and Absalom causes some interesting twist in that dysfunctional family that becomes more dysfunctional seemingly with every moment that's expressed in the Old Testament. So by the time you get to chapter 11, David and Bathsheba, David tries to cover up the fact that he has actually gotten somebody else's wife pregnant, and it doesn't really work. He's not really able to conceal it the way he would like. So the husband of Bathsheba, one of the very devoted and loyal soldiers of David, while has been out fighting in a battle, and while he is gone, this rendezvous takes place. Ultimately, David has Bathsheba's husband murdered, and he finally marries Bathsheba. There's a child that is born. The first child actually dies, doesn't live, but later on there's a child named Solomon that is born to David and Bathsheba. It's another chapter in the story. But when this incident occurs between David and Bathsheba, Amnon and Absalom are preteens. They're not very far apart in age. So here are sons of the king that are age 9, 10, perhaps 11, and I guarantee you that they're going to hear rumors and whispers of what's been happening and what's going on. Years later, when they are in their late teens, chapter 13, Absalom, the son of David, had a lovely sister. His name was Tamar. Amnon, Absalom's half-brother, and half-brother of Tamar. Amnon, the son of David, loved her. In fact, he actually pines away for her. Amnon has a cousin named Jonadab that actually asks him on occasion, "What's wrong? There's something, you're not eating, there's something wrong with you, please tell me." And in verse number 4 of 2 Samuel 13, Amnon says to his cousin, "I love Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." Notice he doesn't say half-sister. So there's a plot that is really hatched, the really inciting of his cousin. Well, you need to pretend to be sick and send word to your father that you need your half-sister Tamar to come actually help nurse you back to health. And when that happens, that's your chance. And when that plot actually unfolds, when she finally does bring food for this sick brother who's not really sick, the statement is made in verse number 11 of chapter 13. When she had brought food to him to eat, he took hold of her and said to her, "Come lie with me, my sister." She answered and said, "No, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing should be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. And where would I take my shame? As for you, you'd be like one of the fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold you from me." Half-brother, half-sister, possible to be married. Interesting day. The statement's made in verse number 14, however, he would not heed her voice. She is trying to resist. She is trying to reason with him. He would not heed her voice. And being stronger than she, he forced her and lay with her. So Amnon rapes his half-sister Tamar. Beginning in verse 15, then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. He tells her, rise and be gone. She said, don't do this. Don't do this. No, indeed, this evil of sending me away is worse than the other that you did to me. But he's not going to listen to her. In fact, in verse number 17, he calls his servants and says to put this woman out. Verse 18, they bolt the door behind her. Verse 19, Tamar puts ashes on her head, tore her robe with many colors that was on her, laid her hand on her head, went away crying bitterly. Her brother Absalom recognizes there's a problem. And he asks her, has Amnon, your brother, been with you? And he says, hold your peace, my sister. He's your brother. Don't take this thing to heart. However, Tamar remained desolate in her brother Absalom's house. The difficulty of dealing with an internal problem such as this, the devastation, the anguish, the guilt, the shame. And the statement is made down in verse number 21. When King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. But he did nothing. It's like father, like son, so far in this story. He's angry, but he does nothing. And there are things that stipulate there are punishments in the law of Moses for this kind of behavior. David does nothing. Guess who notices that? Everybody, including Absalom. Absalom spoke to his brother Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because of the way he had raped Absalom's sister Tamar. 2 full years later, there's a plot that hatches, taking care of livestock. And Absalom pleads with his father for individuals to go with him. And finally, he is really in a plotting way, says, send Amnon, my brother. David finally agrees to that. Absalom commanded his servants in verse 28, watch now, when Amnon's heart is merry with wine, when I say to you, strike Amnon, kill him. Don't be afraid. Be courageous and valiant. Verse 29, the servants of Absalom do exactly what he has asked that they do, and they kill Amnon, the firstborn son of King David. Word gets back to the king that, well, Absalom has actually risen and killed all of your children, and then finally the correct word is, no, he's killed Amnon. Absalom flees. In fact, in verse 37, Absalom fled and went to Talmai, the son of Amminahud, king of Geshur. David mourned for his son every day. Why did Absalom go to Talmai, who's the king of Geshur? The answer to that, you have to go back earlier. Talmai is the maternal grandfather of Absalom. And you get to see the way these events unfold. David's not doing anything. He's upset. Look what's happened to my sister. David, my father, her father, has not done anything in this situation to bring about any kind of justice. I'll take matters into my own hands, and when the timing's right, I'll strike. And he does, and his servants actually kill his half-brother. But he goes to Talmai, king of Geshur, because that's where his grandfather, maternal grandfather, resides. It's almost to say is, I've got to leave here because Dad will do nothing and he doesn't understand. But Granddad will. And that's where he stays. And there's a servant of David named Joab who recognizes the atrocity of all of this and really wants Absalom to be brought back into the presence of the king, wants him back home. And David is reluctant to do that. They set kind of a very specific scheme in motion in chapter 14, which finally culminates in this. The King David finally saying to Joab, verse 21, all right, I've granted this thing. Go therefore and bring back the young man Absalom. Joab fell to the ground on his face and bowed himself and thanked the king. And Joab said, today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, my Lord, O king, and that the king has fulfilled the request of his servant. Your son needs to be back home. So Joab goes to get him, but there's one final statement from David. Verse 24, let him return to his own house, but do not let him see my face. So here are the details. A child of David has been raped by another child of David. And the brother of that daughter of David sees his father do nothing, takes matters into his own hands. His vengeful justice, his retribution, is to kill his half-brother. Then he goes to his granddad. Joab, the servant, sees how wrong this is, and finally actually has David saying, okay, bring Absalom back. Oh, but by the way, I don't want to ever see him again. If you're Absalom and Joab comes with that news, your dad wants you back home. Okay, things are turning around in a positive way. There's going to be a happy ending to this story. But before they get, or by the time they get to the city, if not before, Joab says, oh, by the way, your dad never wants to see you again. How does that strike the heart? So for 2 years, Absalom is living in the city and has not seen his father. And finally, out of desperation, down in verse 28 and following of chapter 14, Absalom has a servant set fire to a field owned by Joab just to get his attention. And Joab says, what have you done? Why have your servant set my field on fire? Verse 32, here's the answer. Absalom answered Joab, look, I sent to you saying, come here so that I may send you to the king to say, why have I come from Geshur? It would have been better for me to be there still. Granddad didn't treat me this way. Now therefore let me see the king's face. If there is iniquity in me, let him execute me. Put me out of my misery. Verse 33, the last verse in chapter 14. Joab went to the king and told him, and when he had called for Absalom, Absalom came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed Absalom. It's too little, too late. The revolt of Absalom against King David begins in the next chapter. It's been festering for years. So when you think about that kind of anger and that kind of dysfunctional family, it's extremely difficult for either of these individuals, especially King David, to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, made some horrible mistakes. Absalom doesn't own up to any kind of mistake either, in taking vengeance into his own hand. When it's difficult to say, I love you, when it's difficult to admit that there have been wrongs on both sides of an issue, what happens? It festers until it boils over. It boils over here in 2 Samuel by the revolt of Absalom against his father. David has to flee from the city. Absalom captures the hearts of the people. David becomes an outcast. Finally, in the end of that rebellion, in a fight that takes place, Absalom, with that long flowing hair that's described in 2 Samuel, gets tangled and is unable to free himself. Joab, fighting for the forces of King David, Joab, the man who brought Absalom back to the city, Joab, the one who said to David, you need to have your son here. Joab hears it. Absalom has been stuck with his hair caught in a tree and hasn't been able to free himself. Joab, verse 14 of chapter 18, takes 3 spears in his hand and goes and thrusts them through Absalom's heart. The man who brought him back to King David ultimately kills him. David, how does David fit into all of this? He has told them in this conflict, please be gentle with my son. That doesn't take place. Joab, the servant of King David, actually kills him. But there's a statement that is made when David hears about the forces of Absalom being defeated. He asks a question in chapter 18 of 2 Samuel, verse 32. Is the young man Absalom safe? The answer is no. He's dead just like Amnon. When he hears that, David says, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. People have got to get past pride and selfishness or whatever the problem may be that stops that communication. In dysfunctional families, maybe one of the biggest things that needs to be present is the ability to say, I'm sorry. Interesting story with a lot of details, with a lot of events that make this a complicated story, but one that relates to a lot of situations today. Please tell those around you how much you love them. And may people on both sides of an issue be able to say, I was wrong. Please forgive me. I love you no matter what. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.